This video is about yield keyword. Let me talk about a very common pattern in programming where you have a function that takes an input or a collection of data, does some processing on it, and returns a new collection of data where each element has been changed fundamentally. Let's take this example shown on the screen where we have a function which called foo takes an input. Then we have an empty list stored in a variable called res. What we do next is we iterate over that input, which might be a collection of data like a list or dictionary or any iterable data type. And then on line 4, we do some processing on that input, and then we append it to that empty list. And finally, on line 5, and by the end of that function, we return res. So it's a long process, which goes through and taking a list, doing some process and returns a changed one. The problem with this is that it's a long operation. We don't get back any of the values till it's finished. And if this data collection is big, we will have a second copy of it in the memory before we can start doing any work on it really. But what we want to do is we want to take each element and do some processing on it right away, and then immediately give it over to the caller of that function. And here the yield keyword comes for a situation like this, where we don't want a temporary collection, which is the res list right here, and where we don't want to iterate many times before we return the value. So in order to use the yield keyword, we will just delete this list right here on line 2. So let me copy this scope block and paste it here. Then let's go ahead and delete that list because we don't need that anymore. We also cannot return the res now because we don't have it. And on line 10, instead of res.append, we will just substitute it by the yield keyword. So yield basically means when you get to this line, line 10, you want to take this value and send it out of the function as the next element in the sequence. And you might think, where do the calling for these values come? Well, if they just iterate over each value, then each value is being handed over immediately while suspending the function for a second. So the process of iterating stops briefly till you ask for the next item. And I know this is an abstract example, so let me give you a practical example so you will get better understanding of the yield keyword. So let's have a function called cube, and cube takes an input of num. Then we will have an empty list. Then we want to iterate over that num, so we'll say for I in num. Then we will do the processing on the input and we will append it to the res list. I multiplied 3 times. And finally, we want to return that res list. Now let's go ahead and create an object. We will call it bar. And here we will invoke our cube function. Then we'll take a list of numbers from 1 to 5. And let's go ahead and print bar python main.py. And there you go. We have a new list with our new cubed numbers. Now let's go ahead and use the yield keyword. And we'll use the same example. Define cube takes num for I in num, and instead of line 16 and 17 we will just use yield and then I multiply 3 times. And let's create our object bar cube 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, and we will print bar exactly like the previous example. If we run the file one more time, we will have a different outcome. Notice that I'm not getting the previous result, 1, 8, 27, 64, and 125. Instead, I'm getting a generator object at this memory address. And this is simply because generators don't hold the entire result in the memory. Instead, it yields one result at a time, as explained previously. So it's waiting for you to ask for the next result of that cube operation. So actually here, we didn't compute any numbers yet. So what we need to do is we need to use the next method. So we will use the next method inside the print. We'll run the file one more time and then we will get 1. As we said, yield hands over one item at a time, waiting for you to ask for the next item. So if we will copy this line 4 more times and we will execute the file, we will get the numbers from 1 through 125 as expected. Alright, so this was the yield keyword briefly explained in Python.